Hey, this is Leo for actualize.org. And in this episode, I'm going to talk about the dirty secret behind all human knowledge. In 10th grade, in high school, I bumped into a person who would forever change the trajectory of my entire life. And his name was Tiago. Tiago was kind of a friend of mine, and he was in some of the similar classes that I was in 10th grade. And basically, Tiago was the most religious person in the entire school. And I grew up in Southern California, so it was a pretty liberal area, wasn't a highly religious area, but this guy was extremely devoutly religious. Like, he would do the whole Christian thing, the whole missionary Christian thing. He was all into that. In fact, he would walk around with a big fat book under his arm. And for the longest time, I thought this was a dictionary. And one time I asked him, hey, what are you doing walking around with a dictionary all the time? And he's like, no, dude, this is a Bible. It's not a dictionary. And it just kind of blew my mind. But anyways, we were in a lot of similar classes, and we started having kind of discussions about religion. And I was just curious about why he's so devoutly Christian, and he was telling me about stuff he did. Anyways, so what happened, though, was that this completely opened my eyes to a whole new world, to like a whole new intellectual domain, because I grew up and I wasn't like adamantly atheistic, but basically I was just very pragmatic about it. And my views on God and how the universe works was basically that what I see before me is pretty much what there is, and there's nothing really hidden. There's nothing to find out. There's no gods out there sitting in the clouds judging me or any of this kind of stuff. So that was my perspective. But then I talked to him, and he has a very different perspective. And I also debated with his friends. And when I started debating with him and his friends, I immediately noticed there was something odd going on, because there was a strange emotional reaction that I saw in them, and also I saw in myself. And this is what today I would call being dogmatic. It's the emotional reaction of being dogmatic, of being set in your own beliefs, of trying to prove your beliefs as correct. And so I was debating with them about many things, and many things that just seemed factually indisputable. For example, the history of the Earth. How old is the Earth? Is the Earth 5,000 years old? How can someone seriously be in a science class learning biology and chemistry and physics, and at the same time also believe that the Earth is only 5,000 years old? What about dinosaur bones? What about radiocarbon dating? What about what physics tells us about the Big Bang Theory and all this kind of stuff? So debating with them made me realize that there's something deeper going on here that I don't quite understand about the human psyche and about reality. Because I thought I would have an easy time convincing them of my points of view, but then I realized it was a lot harder than I thought. In addition to this, I was also in some rigorous history classes at this point in my life, and I was into rigorous science classes, biology and chemistry and physics and all this kind of stuff. And so what I started to see is that from a history point of view, if you take a look at what history is, basically you can describe it as cultures being blind to other cultures. And so it's one culture trying to dominate another culture, or one tribe or one group trying to dominate another tribe, starting wars or waging political rivalries or whatever. But that's basically the way history has unfolded. And when you start to look at that, you start to look at and study all these different cultures, what you start to notice is that, man, a lot of these cultures sure did hold some crazy beliefs. At least from my perspective now, from our culture, it looks like all those are crazy beliefs. So how is it that my beliefs are different? How is it that I can be sure of my beliefs from my culture when all these people, like really smart, intelligent people, scientists and Nobel Prize winners and so forth, held all these other different beliefs? How do we reconcile and arbitrate between different cultures and decide who's right and who's wrong? So that started to create another avenue of doubt in my mind about my worldview. And also, as I was studying the history of science, I saw the amount of intellectual blunders that have been committed by humanity in the last 3,000 years. Many, many blunders by, again, very intelligent, scientifically, rationally minded people. And these blunders just make you wonder, like, well, if 2,000 years ago, the majority of mankind believed that the earth was flat, or just 500 years ago, people believed that the earth is the center of the universe and that the sun orbits around the earth, then how can we be sure that we're not committing these same kind of intellectual blunders today in the modern time? Why don't we take these doubts more seriously? And so in general, I started wondering about this deeper question of, why do intelligent people believe crazy things? At least from my perspective, it seems like there are a lot of people out there who believe crazy things. And certainly from a historical perspective, we know this is true, and they have been proven wrong, centuries later. So we know that now they're wrong. But they didn't know that at the time. And if you try to convince them at that time that they were wrong, then probably they would not believe you and they'd be very dogmatic. And then the other question I had is, how do I really justify my belief that there is no God? Because the core contention I had with Tiago is that he was saying there is a God, I was saying there's not a God, and I really felt like I was right and that he was wrong. But I wasn't quite sure how to really prove it, because there's like different avenues I could take for proving that, and they all didn't seem very conclusive, which struck me as odd, created doubts in my mind. And then I had my major epiphany. And my major epiphany was, wait a minute, what if I'm the one who's wrong here? I'm assuming he's wrong and that he's being dogmatic and he's being deluded about his worldview. But could it be the case, if he could be so deluded, that I could also potentially be so deluded? How could I really honestly assess if I wasn't bullshitting myself? And so here I got the real serious doubt that came up of self-deception. It became a real possibility in my mind that I could be deceiving myself. And so this I took very seriously. I didn't just take it as some abstract philosophical concern. I really thought, like, well, if I can't be sure about my own self-deception, then what can I be sure of at all in life? How can I be certain of anything? How can I know what's actually true? And I was interested in knowing what's true. I wanted to know what actually exists in the world. Do gods exist? Do molecules exist? Do forces exist? Do principles of mathematics exist? What about good and evil? Do those exist? How about moral laws? Do they exist? Do logical laws exist? Does even external reality exist? How can we know for sure? How can we know that we're not wrong? How can we know that we're not deceiving ourselves? So what I started to do is I started to study something called epistemology. Epistemology is the field of philosophy which is concerned with the theory of knowledge. Metaphysics is a branch of philosophy that's concerned with what's true, what's actually physically real. Epistemology is more concerned about how do we know what's true. And in a sense, before you can even answer the question of what's true, you have to first answer the more fundamental question of how can I even know what's true? We're just kind of assuming that I can know. What if I can't? Have we considered that possibility? So I started looking into all these issues and I started reading about it. But more importantly, I actually sat down and started contemplating it and really introspecting to see what's really going on here with my own beliefs and also with the beliefs of people that I'm bumping into. How can I be certain of my own beliefs? And my core question was really, how do I explain why intelligent people hold wrong beliefs and they do it very passionately? And could I be one of these? I really took that as a serious possibility that I could be one of these people. Even though it feels like I'm not, maybe I could. So what I did is I sat down one day and I decided to really examine my beliefs totally objectively from ground zero. And so what I did is I just pulled up a belief like, well, God does not exist. And then I would ask myself, okay, so why is that true? And then I would come up with some kind of justification. In epistemology, they call this a justification. You have a belief. How do you then know that it's actually a valid piece of knowledge? Well, you justify it somehow. You have some sort of explanation or evidence or proof to back it up. So what I would do is I would say, well, okay, so how do I know God does not exist? Well, I can't see him. Okay. And how do I know that that's true? And then how do I know that the next thing is true? And the next thing is true. And the next thing. And so what you do is you just sit down, and you can actually do this. I encourage you to try this. Take any belief you have that you're really certain about and just ask yourself, why is that true? And then whatever answer your mind comes up with, just ask yourself again, and why is that true? And why is that true? And why is that true? It's basically the old kids game, right? You just keep asking and asking and asking, except you take it seriously. And what I discovered is that if I really boil it down, and I do this very objectively, very self-honestly, then I always just arrive at another belief. The justification itself is just another belief. And then if I boil that down, it's just another belief, and another belief, and another belief. And ultimately what happens if you go through it, maybe takes you 5 or 10 steps, you finally get to some kind of ultimate rock bottom belief. And this is what we would call an assumption. And usually these assumptions are so basic and fundamental that it's inconceivable to us that they could be false. They're kind of like self-evident assumptions, we call them. But I started questioning even those. How do I really know what is self-evident and what's not? After all, I don't really see a difference between the original starting belief, such as there is no God, and the more basic, more primitive assumption that justifies it. Why don't I just take the belief that there is no God and have it justify itself? I mean, what's really going on here? I have to be very careful that I'm not deceiving myself because I want to do this very objectively. So what I did is I sat down and I started asking myself, okay, honestly, why do I actually believe this? Why do I believe it? And because I was able to be very self-honest, what I discovered is that the reason I believe it is not because there is a good piece of evidence. The reason I believe it is because it feels right. Intuitively, it makes sense because it fits into other things that I know about the world. If this wasn't the case, then other things in my worldview wouldn't make sense. And so this feels like it's the right puzzle piece that should fit into this whole that I've constructed. But basically, that's a feeling. How can I know that I can trust my feeling? How can I know that I'm not deluded about my intuition? What if my intuition is misguided? What if the universe is not intuitive? What if human intuition is not the only intuition that's out there? After all, different people have different intuitions about these kinds of things, right? So how do we arbitrate between which intuition is the correct one? And perhaps even more damning, how can I really trust myself to be a fair judge in my own trial? Because in a sense, that's what I'm doing. I'm putting myself and my beliefs on trial. But also, who's actually doing the judging here? I am. I'm judging myself. I'm judging my own deepest beliefs. But how can I take the bias out of that? If this was an actual criminal trial, and let's say I committed a murder, and then I had to sit down and judge myself as the judge in the trial, we would say that that's a complete conflict of interest. You can't judge your own murder trial. You need someone else, a third party, to judge for you. But in this case, how do I get a third party to judge for me? If I get a third party, he comes in there and he looks at my beliefs. How do I know that his beliefs are not also biased by his preferences and that he can trust himself? So no matter how many people you get into this party, in the end, there's no ultimate arbiter. So this really started to bring a lot of doubts and skepticism into my worldview. And I sat down, I didn't just do this with the belief in God or no God. I also did it with other beliefs that I hold, more fundamental, more practical, mundane beliefs. You can even take the beliefs such as that the sun will rise tomorrow. How can you be sure that the sun will rise tomorrow? Well, it's risen every single day of my life. And supposedly, humankind says the sun has arisen every single day for as long as humankind has existed. Okay, that might all be true, but how do we know that it will continue to do that? How do we know that tomorrow the sun will not just decide to not do that? You can say, well, physics and gravitational laws tell us that the sun will keep orbiting or appear to keep orbiting around the Earth for hundreds of thousands of years to come. But how do we know there's not an error in those gravitational laws? Well, because they've been proven by many other experiments and other verifiable studies. Well, how do we know there's still not a higher law? After all, Newtonian mechanics was replaced by Einsteinian theories. And so technically Newtonian mechanics is flawed and it's wrong, even though it's a nice approximation. How do we know that Einstein's laws are also not a nice approximation? How do we know that the laws of the universe won't change tomorrow? How do we know they're going to stay consistent? Well, you could say, well, they've been consistent for eternity. Well, how do you know they've been consistent for eternity? I mean, you haven't been alive for eternity. Plus, just because they were consistent up till now doesn't mean they're going to be consistent forever. So it's like these kind of doubts, just like these existential, really deep doubts started to creep into my mind. And ultimately, I came to the conclusion that if I really honestly assess all my beliefs through this process, I can see that all the justifications are just a game. All the justifications are ultimately groundless because it all boils down to some fundamental belief that is never justifiable. It's just accepted on faith. And when I realized that, I had to admit to myself that my belief in no God, that God doesn't exist, is ultimately no more justified than my friend's belief that God does exist. But it didn't just apply to God. This had ramifications for all the other beliefs I had, including all the scientific beliefs that I thought were really true. Because what I start to realize is that every belief system has a personal bias in it. Because basically I'm using my own intuition to judge whether this belief deserves to be valid or doesn't. That's how you do it. If you take a look at what you're doing with your belief system, that's how you're judging. You're judging using your intuition. Does it feel right to you? You're not actually going based on evidence. You think you're going based on evidence, and the mind likes to say that I'm going based on evidence. It likes to say something like, no, Leo, my theories are really based on solid scientific evidence. But that's not really what's going on. You're not being objective enough in assessing what you're really doing in your mind when you're saying that. If you drill it down and you look very, very carefully, I promise you that eventually you'll get to a personal bias and you can actually see your own personal bias at play. It's not just an intellectual thing, it's an emotional thing. You're going to see that your emotions come into play. And in fact, when you try to debate with other people at the dinner table or at a meeting with your friends or in some conference room with a bunch of scientists, you start to have a debate, you start to see that this is prevalent everywhere. People disagree about these kinds of things everywhere. How do we explain that? That's what I really wanted to get to the bottom of. How do we explain that this is a phenomenon of human beings, of human societies? And what I ultimately kind of discovered for myself is that the reason it happens is because we're all just using our intuitions. And of course, our intuitions are highly fallible. And they're highly self-biased. And so that's the game that's being played. It's very interesting that justifications are created by the mind, because if you create a string of 5 or 10 justifications, the mind gets tired after a while. And then what it says is it says something like, oh, okay, this is solid enough. I don't need 100% proof. This is good enough. I'll just believe it. So that's really what's going on inside your mind. No matter what kind of beliefs you hold, whether they are religious ones or scientific ones or philosophical ones or anything else. Even practical, mundane beliefs like the sun will rise tomorrow. So this was all going on in my mind, creating a lot of doubt for me. And I got really interested in philosophy at this point, so I actually became a philosophy major. I started studying philosophy kind of like in a professional manner. Actually wanted to become a philosophy professor. And as I was doing this, I stumbled upon a really brilliant model that helped me to validate some of these plaguing doubts that I had. Because, see, these doubts, I was kind of just trying to figure all this stuff out on my own. And one of my problems was that I wasn't seeing anybody else in society or anybody around me really questioning their beliefs this deeply. It seemed like they just assumed that their beliefs are solid, and they didn't really think about self-deception. They didn't really think about that they could have personal biases. They didn't really care to know why people disagree with each other or why intelligent people believe crazy things. Like, it's like nobody cared about this stuff. And when I saw that no beliefs are ultimately justified, it seems like this is a really big discovery. At least it was in my worldview. But yet nobody takes this seriously when you talk to them about it. So this kind of started getting me to doubt my own self and wondering, am I even on the right track here? Could I still be deluding myself even with all this theorizing? And that was a real possibility. But then I stumbled upon a model, Quine's model. Willard von Orman Quine was an analytical philosopher from the early 1900s. He did a lot of philosophy based around logic and mathematics and science. So this was a hardcore guy. He wasn't just some fruity metaphysician. And he wrote a really seminal paper that shook philosophy circles at the time, and it was called Two Dogmas of Empiricism. It's a paper, it's like a 20-page paper, but I don't recommend you go read it because it's extremely dense, and if you read it, you probably won't understand almost anything he's saying. But the main takeaway from this paper for me was that it validated a lot of the things that I was already suspecting. Namely, he described human knowledge as a field. A field. Picture it this way. Imagine that you have a graph, a knowledge graph in your mind with a bunch of nodes, and it looks kind of like an amoeba. It's got this kind of irregular but circular shape. And it's got a bunch of nodes that are all interconnected together. And so you've got this kind of like lattice work, this framework in your mind. And each node in this graph represents a belief of yours. Every single belief you've got fits into this knowledge graph. So the grass is green, snow is white, dogs have 4 legs and a tail, and that the Earth orbits around the sun, and the sun is in the Milky Way, and E equals mc squared. So every single belief you could possibly imagine fits into this knowledge graph. And the way Quine described it, he said that what's really going on is you have this knowledge graph, but then it only contacts direct experience at the periphery here. So actual raw data, the empirical stuff, the hard facts are only along the edges. And the stuff that's on the inside is all the beliefs there that don't really contact reality directly. So for example, maybe you have a belief such as E equals mc squared. Okay, you might think that that's actually an empirical truth. Well, not exactly, not fully, because that sits as a belief more inside towards the center rather than at the very periphery of the knowledge graph. Why is that? Because you don't actually see E equals mc squared as an observable fact. That's something you have to prove and demonstrate through modeling and various mathematical functions, and you have to combine all that stuff together, and then you get a end result from that, a conclusion called E equals mc squared, and then you can take that on as a belief. By the way, a belief is simply a statement about reality that you think is true. Or it's a statement about reality that you think is false. Either one of those is a belief, technically speaking. So what Quine said is that human knowledge is this graph. And what I want to do is I want to point out some interesting features that he himself pointed out about this graph. And I'll do that by reading you some really eloquent quotes from Quine, because he does a really good job of describing this. So here we go. He says, quote, "The totality of our so-called knowledge or beliefs, from the most casual matters of geography and history to the profoundest laws of atomic physics or even the pure mathematics and logic, is a man-made fabric which impinges on experience only along the edges." End quote. So that's a really important statement. So basically what he's saying is that no matter what belief you hold, whether it's abstract logical or mathematical beliefs, or just simple scientific beliefs, or historical beliefs, or geographic facts. This is still part of a man-made fabric, your knowledge graph, and that this knowledge graph only loosely fits with empirical data. The knowledge graph itself is much deeper and wider than the data itself. The data is just on the periphery. It's just the rim. It's like the envelope, right? The envelope is very thin and it's very scanty. And then you've got all this stuff in the middle, which is kind of up to you. You can fudge it however you want. Next, he goes on to say, quote, "A conflict with experience at the periphery occasions readjustments in the interior of the field. Truth values have to be redistributed over some statements. Reevaluation of some statements entails reevaluation of others because of their logical interconnections. The logical laws themselves being in turn simply certain further statements in the system, certain further elements of the field. But the total field is so underdetermined by its boundary conditions that there is much latitude of choice as to what statements to reevaluate in light of any single contrary experience." End quote. This here is extremely important. So imagine that you have your knowledge graph and you think that it fits nicely with experience. Now what happens is you get a new piece of experience come in, right? Because we're always seeing new hard experience coming in. If we see a new brute fact come in, now our knowledge graph has to account for it somehow. So now what's going to have to happen is that a ripple will cascade through the knowledge graph, starting from the point where the knowledge graph meets the hard fact. So there'll have to be some adjustment. And also, the rest of the knowledge graph can adjust itself to accommodate and explain away this brute fact in various ways. There's not just one way to do it. That's the key here. He uses the word underdetermined. The whole system is underdetermined. What does that mean? That means that there could be many configurations of the system that will account for all the raw facts. And that right there to me was the key that showed me that this model must be correct, because this is exactly what's happening with human beings. Is it seems like we have worldviews, lots of different worldviews, but basically the same facts. We're all living in the same world, basically. I mean, my experience of reality is not that much different than yours, and we agree on many things, but also we disagree on some stuff. And we disagree with a lot of different people. Why is there a disagreement? Well, because there's this underdetermined element. Not every single belief is pinned down by hard facts. This gives you wiggle room, so to speak. Next, he goes on to say, quote, "If this view is right, it is misleading to speak of empirical content of an individual statement, especially if it is a statement at all remote from the experiential periphery of the field." End quote. So what this means is that you can't just take a single belief and really verify if it's true or if it's false. You can't just take a belief like God exists or he doesn't exist. Or you can't just take a belief such as the Earth orbits around the sun and just say if it's true or false, because it depends on other beliefs and other facts within your worldview. The whole thing is interconnected in a very deep way, which means that if you change one part of the model, you probably have to make adjustments elsewhere in the system. He goes on to say, quote, "Any statement can be held true come what may if we make drastic enough adjustments elsewhere in the system. Even a statement very close to the periphery can be held true in the face of recalcitrant experience by pleading hallucination or by amending certain statements called logical laws." End quote. So this is huge. This right here explains why it's impossible to argue with a fundamentalist. Because a fundamentalist, what he does is he takes a certain fact or a certain belief and holds it as so true that he's able to then readjust his entire knowledge graph to then somehow support or buffer that one belief or that one statement from contact with direct experience. So even something as obvious as the sun is shining in the morning, if you really wanted to, you could deny this fact. And the way you could deny it is you could say, well, yeah, it appears that the sun is shining on my face in the morning, but that's just an appearance. Actually, I'm hallucinating. Or actually, I'm in the matrix, and outside the matrix, there's no sun at all. You see? So now this kind of goes into far-fetched territory, and you might be thinking, well, yeah, that's really far-fetched though, Leo. But if you take a look at what's going on when you argue politics or religion or environment or some other hot topic issue with an average human being, what you discover is this is exactly what happens. You present them with some kind of fact which you think will convince them that, oh, they're wrong and you're right. But what you discover is actually no, what they do is they take that fact, they acknowledge the fact, but then they reconfigure their whole scheme so that it explains that fact away in a nice, convenient way without them having to admit that this fact somehow breaks their whole model. You see? And what's really profound here is that even the logical laws themselves are a part of this model. There is nothing that's outside of this model. Everything you think is right is a belief in this model. Everything, even the most fundamental, unquestionable things, are just additional beliefs. And what's crazy is that things like the logical laws, these are not actually hard empirical facts. These are things that sit in the middle of the knowledge graph. The stuff that sits in the middle of the knowledge graph, that's the stuff that's the most unassailable. That's also the stuff that allows you to hold on to no matter what evidence is presented. So this is where people get into really lots of trouble, is when they try to maintain a position or a theory or a belief that is really, really far from the periphery of the field, because then no amount of evidence can get and pierce through into the middle to get that belief to change, right? Because it has to ripple through all the other beliefs, which is exactly what happens if you try to argue with a fundamentalist religious person, is that they have layer after layer after layer and layer of beliefs that protect the core belief that you're trying to attack. Of course, this is not just true of religious people. It's also true of scientific people. It's true of every person. So this is not just being used as an attack on religion. Just actually the opposite. What this does is this levels the playing field a lot. Because in science, what we like to say is we like to say, well, no, but scientific truths are much more accurate and verifiable than religious claims. It certainly feels like scientific claims have a certain higher standing in our mind. They seem more empirical. Well, what Quine demonstrated with this paper is that actually they're not any more empirical. The logical laws are not any more empirical. And you can actually sit down and question in your own mind why you believe in the logical laws, and what you'll discover is that actually it's an intuition that you have. The logical laws are not some carved in stone, absolutely given by God commandment to us. The logical laws are part of this man-made fabric, and you believe in them because ultimately, after all the rationalizations are cut down and boiled away, you believe in them because it feels right and it makes sense in your worldview. And if they stopped being believed in, then your worldview would not feel as cohesive and as integrated. Quine went on to say, quote, "Revision even of the logical law of the excluded middle has been proposed as a means of simplifying quantum mechanics," end quote. And quantum mechanics was a field that was just coming into its own while Quine was writing this stuff and coming up with his theories. And in quantum mechanics, a lot of weird stuff happens. A lot of very counterintuitive stuff happens about reality that scientists and mathematicians who study this stuff will admit that it functions in such a weird way that all your intuitions have to fly out the window. which of course is a really interesting clue, which shows us that reality could be structured in such a way that your mind is not able to intuit anymore what's correct and what's not correct. Which is exactly the doubt that I had in my mind. How do I know if my intuition is right or wrong about this issue? How can I trust myself? Quine goes on to say, quote, "For my part, I believe in physical objects and not in Homer's gods. And I consider it a scientific error to believe otherwise. But in point of epistemological footing, the physical objects and the gods differ only in degree and not in kind. Both sorts of entities enter into our conceptions only as cultural posits. The myth of physical objects is epistemologically superior to most in that it has proved more effective than other myths as a device for working a manageable structure into the flux of experience." End quote. So this is some heavy stuff right here. He's basically putting all beliefs on the same level playing field. So your belief, if you can imagine, in physical objects is no more or less justified than your belief in God, or your belief in whatever other thing you think is very, very certain and true, right? You have to recognize that these are conceptual entities that we create, whether it's gods or physical objects or physical forces or atoms or quarks or whatever. These are not things you directly encounter in experience. These are not brute hard facts. These are actually things that exist within the center of your knowledge graph because they're useful for explaining the raw hard facts. You see? And a lot of people get this wrong about science. Science is not brute hard facts. What science is a lot of modeling and conceptualizing, and those concepts and models are then buttressed and supported by experiments and brute hard facts, but still, there's a lot of interpretation that goes on. A lot of wiggle room for what kind of models you can create. And this is something that most people fail to acknowledge about science. Quine goes on to say, quote, "Physical objects, small and large, are not the only posits. Forces are another example. And indeed, we are told today that the boundary between energy and matter is obsolete. Moreover, abstract entities, which are the substance of mathematics, are another posit in the same spirit. Epistemologically, these are myths on the same footing with physical objects and gods, neither better nor worse, except for differences in the degree to which they expedite our dealings with sense experiences." End quote. So he's continuing on, and he's even strengthening the claim here, right? Even mathematics is not excluded from this discussion. Even logic is not excluded from this discussion. All of these things are man-made creations, you understand? It's really important to understand this, that these are man-made creations. And the only reason we care about them or feel that they're true is because in some sense they help us to deal with sense experiences, with the raw data, the indisputable raw data. But actually, most of us completely ignore the raw data. And what we do is we get lost in the theories and the models and these abstract entities. And we don't acknowledge to ourselves that these are abstract entities. And so we get lost in this kind of fairy tale land. And then what we do is we go and we start debating and arguing with people without understanding what we're really doing here. And lastly, Quine said, and this is a famous quote of his, he says, quote, "Our statements of the external world face the tribunal of sense experience not individually, but only as a corporate body." End quote. Which means that you're never evaluating any one individual statement. It's not like you're just going to go and say, well, does God exist? Let me go check. It doesn't work that way. All of your statements, all of your beliefs come into play all at the same time. They all reinforce each other. You're dragging everything. You're basically dragging the person's entire worldview into the argument when you're questioning God, which is exactly what you get when you're questioning someone's religious beliefs. You don't just question a little intellectual fact or a little single statement. Their entire worldview gets dragged in there. And what you notice is the person gets very defensive very quickly. And they get very emotional. And then you get very defensive and you get very emotional. And then there's a heated debate. Why is that? Because you have a literal clashing of two knowledge graphs that don't fit together. So that's Quine's model. Now, this validated a lot of my own kind of discoveries and research. And what this led me to is just some of the following takeaways, some of the following conclusions that I had. Basically, what I saw was that there's a ton of leeway for personal preference within how we construct our knowledge graphs. Our knowledge graphs are mostly arbitrary. They're not nearly as set in stone and fixed as we think and as we like to believe. There's so much wiggle room that you could almost say that these are complete fictions of the mind. That's how much wiggle room there is here. And yet this is almost never acknowledged. Everyone, whether they're scientific or religious or spiritual or philosophical, everyone creates fictional entities in their own minds. A fictional entity could be God, or it could be a corporation, or it could be atoms and molecules, or it could be energy, or dark matter, right? Scientists have come up with tons of fictional entities, even more than religious people have. God is one of these entities, and it's no different fundamentally from the entity such as an atom or a molecule. Not if you really look at it objectively. Another takeaway for me was that worldviews work in a holistic way, like I just described, right? The entire worldview gets questioned simultaneously. And this makes the worldview very difficult to question. It's extremely easy for the other person to weasel out of any argument you create because this knowledge graph has a certain integrity, a certain structure to it, and it's got a lot of ways that it can just kind of like grow and morph itself and do some mental gymnastics and accommodate any kind of fact that you present to it. And this is extremely damaging and dangerous because it creates a massive blind spot possibility. It creates this possibility where you can feel like you're certain and you're right and your knowledge graph is correct, but actually what's happening is that your knowledge graph is morphing around all the facts, and you're just excusing them away or denying them. And then, of course, another takeaway for me was that argumentation and justification is just a game. It's a tool that the knowledge graph uses to maintain its structural integrity. That's what you're doing when you're actually arguing or justifying something in your own mind. And of course, I'm not just talking about all the people you disagree with. I'm talking about you. Most importantly, I'm talking about you. So when you are arguing and you feel like you're right, and when you're justifying in your mind something, even when you're justifying something like, oh, that guy's such an idiot, he shouldn't have called me that, he's so wrong for doing that thing that he did to me. Just a very mundane example from ordinary life. Not philosophical at all. But in that situation, you're justifying to yourself why you're right and he's wrong. And that is all part of your knowledge graph. You see? Your knowledge graph is not just vague, abstract, philosophical concepts such as, does God exist? Do molecules exist? And this kind of scientific stuff. It's all the practical stuff too. What are your beliefs about women? What are your beliefs about men? What are your beliefs about politics? What are your beliefs about how you should raise children? What are your beliefs about sex? What are your beliefs about what's right and what's wrong? What's moral, what's immoral? What are your beliefs about terrorism? What are your beliefs about rape and murder and theft? What are your beliefs about personal development? What are your personal beliefs about what you can accomplish in life? What are your beliefs about your spouse, your girlfriend, your boyfriend, and your family members? What are your ideological beliefs about how the world works? What's your cosmology, your personal cosmology? How do you think the universe is structured and functions? All of this stuff is part of the knowledge graph. Everything. Even when you think that you're going to walk out tomorrow and see the sun shining in your face in the morning, that's part of your knowledge graph. And even a statement such as grass is green or snow is white is all part of your knowledge graph. So I hope you can see that this is not just something for like philosophical debates. This here is something that directly speaks to what's happening in your life. And the problem is that nobody wants to admit that this is actually happening. Nobody wants to admit that we're all playing a justification game in our mind, and really, in a sense, this knowledge graph is controlling us more than we control it. What people care about actually is practicality. They don't really care about truth. They don't care about what's ultimately true. They care about what's convenient to them in their life. If you really look honestly, that's what you care about. You don't care about anything else. Even if you're a philosopher, you don't really care about anything else. Even if you're a scientist, you don't really care about anything else. You care about practicality. Do your beliefs explain away the world in such a way that you feel confident and certain and safe? And as soon as they don't, you are in emotional reaction against it. And that right there pretty much explains what's going on with why people disagree so much and hold crazy beliefs despite being otherwise intelligent. The only thing that we could claim as being true, really, is not this knowledge graph, but the experience itself that lies at the edge of the knowledge graph. That's the truest thing we have access to. And even that, you have to understand, is still extremely limited, because basically what we're saying is that we're reducing everything down to our sense organs. Sight, sound, vision, well, that's sight, also smell, taste, touch, right? Those are all our senses. So that is what we're actually receiving as hard factual data. But what's crazy about that is that that's just unique to human beings, right? A human being happens to have vision. A bat does not. A human being happens to have smell. A bacterium might not. I don't know if bacteriums have smell. Probably not. A human being has hearing. Some other creatures might not. So what can we really know for sure? What can we really know for certain? And what I concluded was that, well, we can't really know what's absolutely true, because we have this knowledge graph, and this knowledge graph is always biased. It's always operating towards itself. It's always trying to serve its own self-agenda. And then we have our sense organs, and our sense organs are just limited to us as human beings. So what happened for me at this point, this happened kind of late in college, is I just basically kind of started to give up the search for absolute truth. Because that's what was driving me, is how do I find absolute truth? And what I basically discovered is that I can't find absolute truth. And at that point, I just said, well, if I can't find absolute truth, then I have to give up on philosophy. And so I did. I actually decided not to become a philosophy professor because of this. And yet still there was something nagging in my mind about this whole thing, you know. I told myself, oh, I'm just going to go work on my career and work on my relationships, you know, just do the ordinary mundane life kind of stuff. This philosophy stuff is just too philosophical. It's not very practical. But something in my mind told me that there must be something practical here, because there's something very deeply true about how human beings interact, and this model really fits. I just couldn't figure out, you know, how do I connect it all together? And also I couldn't understand, you know, science is so effective. Technology has advanced humanity so much, and we've accomplished so much. I mean, we've landed a man on the moon. How is it that fictitious entities that science has created has allowed us to do this? Whereas, some other kind of fictitious entities are not able to accomplish any work in the real world. How is that possible? So there are still questions that didn't quite click for me, but I just put them all aside and went and lived my ordinary practical life. And I did that for 6 years until one day I read about enlightenment. And when I read about enlightenment, I read about the master stroke, the whole clincher to this thing. And the master stroke is this. And this is something that I had not considered before in all my theorizing and in all my ruminations about this issue. And the master stroke is this. What if it was possible to get rid of the self? This boundary that I feel exists between me as a creature standing here, as a human being standing here, and the external world that I'm interacting with, what if that's a conceptual boundary and not a physical boundary? What if this self, is actually a node within the knowledge graph? That's the master stroke. Because think about what this really means. What this really means is that if there's a self, that means this self has a personal agenda and a bias. So that's one thing. Also, what it means is that the self doesn't have direct access to reality. So how can I know reality directly? Well, I can't. I have to do it through my senses, and I have to do it through my mind. Because I'm separate from reality, see? But what if I'm not separate from the reality? What if the self is an illusion and I can get rid of that? And then what happens is then I have a possibility of direct access to empirical reality. That blew my mind. That piqued my curiosity to the highest that it's ever been on this issue. Because for the first time, I saw the solution to the whole problem here. And this is what I was looking for the whole time, but I didn't really know how to get to it because I didn't consider that something so radical could be possible. It's so obvious you dismiss it. But this really allows us to get rid of the personal bias problem. This allows us to access truth directly without using the knowledge graph at all, you see? You don't need to construct entities or models about truth. You can get truth straight from the source, so to speak. At least that becomes a possibility if you allow for the possibility of getting rid of the self. Now, that's not proven for us yet. We have to demonstrate that. Is that true? Can we actually do that? Well, at least there's a possibility intellectually that maybe we can. And then what truth becomes not a model of truth, not a concept, not an entity explaining truth, but truth, actually what truth is it's what remains after the knowledge graph has been completely destroyed. Right? Because truth is what's at the root, at the rock bottom of everything. Truth is what we're trying to explain. The explanations are not truth. The explanations are just explanations. And that's what got me really interested in enlightenment. Really interested. Now, at this point, you might say, well, Leo, all this sounds like just more theory. So how did you solve any problems here? Because all you're doing is you're just doing more philosophy, and you just gave us another theory here. And isn't Quine's model just another theory? Isn't it just another model? And of course, the answer is yes. Quine's model is just another model. And everything I told you here is just more models and more theories and more concepts. It's just beliefs, right? I'm just giving you more beliefs to believe. And of course, that's silly. Yes, that's silly, because what you're trying to do is you're trying to take my beliefs here and you're trying to add them to your knowledge graph. And of course, nothing changes because you've just added one more node to the knowledge graph. Nothing changes, even if you believe me. If you don't believe me, that's another knowledge graph node that you've added, which says Leo is wrong. Doesn't change anything. If you want to change something, and here's where something can really change, is if you decide instead of adding stuff to your knowledge graph to destroy the graph entirely. That's when you can get a real change. But you can't destroy the knowledge graph just by listening to me. You can't destroy it by thinking more stuff. You can't think your way into enlightenment. You can't think your way into truth. In fact, your thoughts and your models and your beliefs about reality is the only thing that separates you from truth and enlightenment. If you're smart and you see the ramifications of what I'm saying here, then these are very serious ramifications. In fact, you should, I hope, see that everything you hear from me with actualize.org videos, every single video I've talked about, including all my enlightenment videos, that all of this is just adding more shit to your knowledge graph. That's all it's doing. All the personal development material you've studied and read in your entire life and will read is just adding more to your knowledge graph. That's what it's doing. It can't do anything else. You see? Because this is how human knowledge works. This is what human knowledge is. It's a game. It's a fucking game. What people are doing in life is they're rearranging a web of bullshit. That's what they're doing. And this is exactly what explains why people disagree so much about so many things and that they're impossible to convince, and it's almost impossible to get them to change their perspectives. This is why. Because people are so busy rearranging their bullshit web of beliefs that they don't recognize that they're just beliefs and that there's something actually deeper going on. And even if they do recognize that, they still don't have enough wisdom to see that what's required is not to add this to their graph, but to take this as a hint that they have to destroy their graph. So you might wonder, well, Leo, what's the use of listening to you then if all you're doing is adding more to our graph? And the answer to that is very paradoxical. In a sense, there is no use in listening to me. But also in a sense there is, because what we're doing here is we're fighting illusion with illusion. Most illusion that you hear from society and from other people and from personal development books, what they give you is they give you illusion that doesn't call itself out as illusion. The difference with me is that in this video, for example, I'm telling you that what I'm telling you is an illusion. And you can be intelligent and wise enough to actually register that, to read between the lines of what I said, and to put yourself on track with perhaps deciding to question your knowledge graph and to finally stop the process of adding more shit to your knowledge graph and rearranging your knowledge graph to defend your ego and to defend all your personal biases. Because that is what you've been doing your whole life. All your beliefs about men, women, children, family, religion, politics, science, it's all just rearranging bullshit. That's what it is. That's what it is, and you can sit down, you can actually discover this for yourself. You don't need to believe me on this point. In fact, it won't really help you to believe me, because a belief is just another addition to the knowledge graph. What you need to do is destroy your knowledge graph. And that really is the direction in which actualize.org will be going in the future, is that my chief concern will be to help you to destroy, systematically destroy your entire knowledge graph. And why are we doing this? Because when you destroy your knowledge graph, what you remain with is truth. And truth, as it turns out, is a very paradoxical thing and a very counterintuitive thing. And it is actually the thing that you've been searching for your whole life. It is ultimately the reason that you started doing personal development. You didn't do personal development to get a girlfriend. You didn't do personal development to improve your marriage. You don't do personal development because you want more money. Those are all bullshit reasons. The ultimate reason why you're doing personal development without even being conscious of it yet is you're doing it to discover truth. The truth of your own being, who you really are and what reality really is. Because let me tell you, when you discover truth, it is not the truth of philosophy. It is not the truth of science. Those are not truths. That is beliefs. That's fiction in the knowledge graph. Actual truth outside the knowledge graph is something vastly different. It's a profound, life-changing truth. It's a very practical thing. It's not something that's just like, oh yeah, I know something. It's not that kind of knowing. It's a being. You have to become the truth. You have to remove the barrier between you and the world. And when you remove the barrier between you and the world, then all of your problems in life dissolve. Everything you thought was bothering you, everything you thought was wrong with the world dissolves. Because guess what? Your problems, they're all nodes in the knowledge graph. That's it. I'm done. I'm signing off. Click the like button for me, please. Share this video with a friend. Post your comments down below. And come check out actualize.org right here. This is my newsletter. Sign up to the newsletter so you can stay tuned. Stay tuned on this journey of self-actualization. It's a deep rabbit hole we're going down. Deep, 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 deep stuff. All of this stuff, I promise you, is extremely practical. I don't just come up here to spout philosophy and bullshit. I'm interested in getting you the most profound transformation possible in your life. And this is how it's going to get done. And I don't just talk about it, but I also do it in my own life. So if you keep watching me, you'll see that I'm doing this in my life as well. I'm going to systematically destroy my knowledge graph, and you will see the result of what I become from doing that. That will be pretty cool. So that's what's in store. Sign up, stay tuned, and I'll see you soon with more.